If you have ever judged an old veteran by what you could see, you might want to hear this first." The words floated through the little harbor diner like an old memory carried in on the Chesapeake breeze. Nobody looked up at first. The breakfast crowd was busy with hot coffee, fried eggs, and quiet conversations before another workday on the nearby naval base. Silverware tapped against thick ceramic plates. The coffee machine hissed softly behind the counter. Outside, gulls drifted above the marina where fishing boats rocked against their lines. In the corner booth closest to the window sat Thomas Callahan, 82 years old, wearing a faded olive jacket that had been carefully brushed clean despite its age. Before taking his first sip, he turned the handle of his coffee mug until it faced exactly the same direction it always had. It was a small habit, almost invisible, the kind a man carried for decades, without realizing it. His weathered hands rested quietly around the warm cup, while his pale blue eyes watched the harbor instead of the room behind him. He never seemed to look at people directly, yet somehow he always knew where everyone was. Chief Petty Officer Ethan Brooks noticed the faded tattoo slipping from beneath the old man's rolled sleeve as he reached for the sugar bowl. Brooks slowed to a stop, glanced toward two younger sailors beside him, and let out a laugh that was louder than the room required. "Well, look at that. Did you pick up that tattoo at a county fair, old-timer?" A few nervous chuckles answered him, but not everyone joined in. The waitress paused with a coffee pot in her hand, sensing the air change in a way that experienced servers always could. Thomas did not answer. He stirred his coffee once, set the spoon neatly beside the saucer, and looked back toward the water as though the question belonged to someone else. Brooks smiled wider, mistaking silence for weakness. He had no way of knowing that before the morning was over, every person in that diner would remember the quiet old man by the window for the rest of their lives. Thomas Callahan had discovered many years ago that silence unsettled certain people far more than an argument ever could. He left the question hanging in the air as naturally as the steam rising from his coffee. The faded tattoo remained visible for only a moment before his sleeve slipped back toward his wrist, but by then Brooks had already decided what kind of man he was looking at. The old veteran's face carried the deep lines of a life spent outdoors, his silver hair neatly combed beneath a weathered navy ball cap, with no unit insignia stitched across the front. There were no medals pinned to his jacket, no patches asking for recognition, no photographs spread across the table inviting conversation. He looked like thousands of retired men who quietly filled diners across America every morning, and that was exactly how Thomas preferred it. He had spent the last 20 years arriving at almost the same time every Tuesday, always choosing the booth facing the harbor, instead of the television mounted above the counter. He liked watching the tide more than the news because the tide never exaggerated. The waitress Mary walked over carrying the coffee pot before he even needed to ask. "Morning, Thomas," she said with a warm smile. "The usual?" He returned the smallest smile, the kind that barely reached the corners of his mouth, but somehow felt genuine every single time. "Please, Mary, thank you." She filled his mug without asking another question. She knew he always took 2 packets of sugar, never stirred more than once, and always left enough money beneath the saucer to cover breakfast and a generous tip. She had never asked about the faded tattoo because she had learned that decent people did not pull on threads. Someone else had carefully left alone. Brooks watched the familiar exchange with folded arms. "So everybody knows him?" he asked one of the younger sailors beside him. The sailor shrugged. "I have seen him around before. Quiet guy. Comes in all the time." Brooks nodded as if that confirmed something important. "Exactly. Just another local trying to look interesting." Thomas heard every word. Age had softened his hearing, but years spent working around engines, wind, and open water had taught him to notice voices more than volume. He lifted the mug with both hands, warming fingers that had grown stiff over the decades. Outside the window, a tugboat eased slowly across the harbor, while a pair of gulls rode the breeze without flapping their wings. Thomas watched them for several seconds, unconsciously measuring the wind by the angle of their flight. Daniel Mercer noticed the glance immediately. Sailors learned to read water, weather, and movement, and there was something almost instinctive about the way the old man studied the harbor. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Yet Daniel had the strange feeling he was watching someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention to details everyone else had forgotten to see. Brooks stepped closer to the booth, convinced that the quiet old man in front of him was simply avoiding a conversation he could not win, never realizing that Thomas Callahan had stopped trying to prove himself to strangers before Brooks had even been born. Chief Petty Officer Ethan Brooks rested one hand lightly against the empty chair across from Thomas Callahan's booth, wearing the easy confidence of a man who had spent his career believing that every answer could be found in a manual, a database, or a service record. "You know," he said with a grin, "every tattoo tells a story. The difference is that most of them are actually true." One of the younger sailors laughed, but the sound faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes from the harbor and looked at Brooks with an expression that held neither irritation nor embarrassment. It was the quiet patience of someone who had watched enough tides to know that every wave eventually found the shore. "You could be right," Thomas answered. "Most stories should stay where they belong." Brooks smiled wider, convinced he had cornered the old man. "That sounds like a convenient way of saying there is no story at all." He leaned forward just enough to study the faded circle beneath the rolled sleeve. Time had nearly erased the ink. The edges had blurred into weathered skin until the symbol looked almost meaningless. "I have spent years around sailors from every fleet on the East Coast," Brooks continued. "I have never seen that mark on a single official roster, training manual, or historical display." Thomas nodded once. "I would expect that." The answer landed so calmly that Brooks mistook it for surrender. "Exactly," he replied, "because it probably does not mean anything." Mary quietly set a fresh plate of toast on Thomas's table. Before walking away, she gave Brooks a brief glance that carried no anger, only the silent reminder that breakfast had never needed an audience. Brooks barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the faded tattoo. Thomas thanked Mary, broke a small piece of toast, and scattered a few crumbs onto the plate without eating them. Outside the window, a pair of gulls circled lower over the marina. He watched their movement for only a heartbeat before shifting his coffee mug a fraction of an inch away from the edge of the table, almost as if guided by habit rather than thought. Daniel Mercer noticed both movements. The old veteran never seemed distracted, yet he quietly adjusted to every small change around him without conscious effort. Daniel had seen experienced boat captains do the same thing before rough weather arrived. Brooks took another step closer. "People earn respect by what they have done," he said, "not by letting strangers wonder about faded ink." Thomas looked at him with tired but steady eyes. Respect that depends on being explained usually does not last very long. The words were gentle, spoken almost like advice instead of correction, but they left Brooks searching for another response. Determined not to lose face in front of the younger sailors, he reached his hand toward the weathered symbol once again. Then maybe somebody ought to find out what this old tattoo is really hiding. Daniel felt an uneasy weight settle in his chest as Brooks's fingers moved closer, sensing that the quiet morning had reached the point where one careless touch could awaken memories that had remained undisturbed for more than 40 years. Brooks's fingertips brushed the faded circle for no more than an instant. It was a careless gesture, little more than the absent tap of someone convinced he was exposing an empty legend. Yet the moment his skin touched the weathered ink, Thomas Callahan stopped moving altogether. Coffee remained suspended halfway between the table and his lips before he quietly set it back onto the saucer without spilling a single drop. The rich aroma of fresh coffee, toasted bread, and maple syrup slowly faded from his senses. In its place came another smell that no passage of time had ever managed to erase. Damp earth after heavy rain, salt carried inland by a warm coastal wind, engine oil lingering on canvas packs that had seen too many miles. Somewhere in the distance, rotor blades rolled through humid air with the slow, familiar rhythm of another lifetime. Thomas was no longer looking through the diner's front window. He was seeing sunlight filtering through towering jungle trees, where every beam of light disappeared into drifting mist before it reached the ground. 5 young men stood beneath a camouflage tarp stretched carefully between thick trunks. None of them wore expressions that belonged in photographs. They looked tired in the quiet way only responsibility could make a man tired. One of them reached into a worn canvas pouch and unfolded a small square of cloth. Inside rested a simple needle, a bottle of dark ink, and an old brass compass with a cracked crystal face. Nobody hurried. Nobody filled the silence with speeches. The oldest among them simply looked around the circle before saying, "Someday people will ask where we were. We will tell them we were exactly where we needed to be." No one argued. Another young sailor smiled faintly before adding, "Then this stays with us." The symbol was drawn by hand on a scrap of paper already softened by rain and folded 100 times. It was never designed for recognition. It was meant to recognize one another if fate ever scattered them across different lives. One by one they accepted the mark without ceremony, not as decoration but as a promise that memory would outlive paperwork. The jungle faded as quietly as it had appeared. Thomas blinked once. The harbor returned. The coffee cooled beside his hand. Gulls drifted above the marina exactly as they had moments before. Brooks withdrew his hand with a satisfied grin, completely unaware that he had disturbed something sacred. "Still looks like nothing to me," he said with a shrug. Thomas slowly rolled his sleeve back into place, smoothing the fabric with careful fingers that paused for only the briefest moment before becoming perfectly steady again. His voice carried no resentment, only the weight of years. "Some things were never meant to survive in books," he said softly. "They survive because a few people remember." Daniel Mercer watched the old veteran's eyes for another second. They had returned from somewhere far away, yet they still carried the quiet distance of a man who had walked through memories nobody else in the room could possibly understand. Without saying a word to anyone, Daniel slipped his phone from his pocket, stepped toward the front door, and followed an instinct that suddenly felt too important to ignore. Cool morning air met Daniel Mercer the moment he stepped outside. He stopped beside the weathered wooden railing overlooking the harbor and glanced back through the diner's front window. Thomas Callahan had not moved. He still sat quietly by the glass with both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, looking more interested in the tide than the people around him. Brooks had already turned back toward the younger sailors, wearing the satisfied expression of a man convinced he had uncovered another harmless old story. Daniel could not explain the uneasiness settling in his chest. It was not the tattoo itself. It was everything surrounding it. The old veteran had never defended himself. He had never raised his voice. He had never tried to impress anyone. Daniel remembered something his grandfather, a retired Navy chief, used to tell him when he was a boy. The loudest men usually want recognition. The quiet ones already know who they are. For reasons he could not fully understand, those words returned with unusual clarity. He unlocked his phone and searched through a contact list he had never expected to use. After a brief hesitation, he called the administrative office attached to the Admiral's headquarters. A calm voice answered. "Office of Admiral Holloway." Daniel stood a little straighter without thinking. "Good morning. My name is Petty Officer Daniel Mercer. I apologize for calling directly, but I believe I may have witnessed something that deserves attention." There was a brief pause before the duty officer replied. "Go ahead, Petty Officer." Daniel chose his words carefully. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. "There is an elderly gentleman at Harbor View Diner. His name is Thomas Callahan. He appears to be in his early 80s. He has a faded circular tattoo on his forearm. I cannot identify it, but—" He stopped for a moment, searching for the right words. "Sir, it is not the tattoo that concerns me. It is the way he carries himself. I have never seen anyone remain that calm while being treated the way he was." Silence answered him for several long seconds. Papers shifted softly somewhere on the other end of the line. Then the duty officer spoke again. This time much more carefully. "Repeat the name." "Thomas Callahan." Another pause followed, noticeably longer than the first. "Describe the tattoo." Daniel looked through the window again. Thomas had lifted his mug, turned the handle slightly before taking a sip, then returned it to exactly the same spot on the table. Such a tiny habit somehow made the old man appear even more disciplined. "The ink is badly faded," Daniel said. "A simple circle with an older design inside. It almost looks handmade." The duty officer took a slow breath. "Stay where you are, Petty Officer Mercer. Do not question the gentleman. Do not allow this situation to escalate if you can avoid it. I am notifying the Admiral's executive officer immediately." The line ended before Daniel could ask another question. He lowered the phone and stared at the harbor, listening to the distant cry of gulls above the water. Inside the diner, nothing appeared to have changed. Thomas Callahan remained quietly alone with his coffee, while Brooks laughed with his friends, completely unaware that a single respectful phone call had already begun, reaching people who understood exactly how much history could be hidden beneath a faded mark that almost no longer existed. Admiral Richard Holloway was reviewing maintenance reports inside headquarters when his executive officer entered without knocking, something he almost never did. He carried no folder, only a tablet and an expression that immediately caught the Admiral's attention. "Sir," he said quietly, "I believe this cannot wait." Holloway closed the report in front of him and folded his reading glasses with deliberate care. "What is it?" The executive officer glanced at the screen before answering. "A petty officer from the Harbor Diner called a few minutes ago. His name is Daniel Mercer. He did not report an incident. He reported a man." Holloway listened without interrupting. The gentleman identified himself as Thomas Callahan, early 80s, quiet, wearing an old olive jacket. The sailor described a faded handmade circular tattoo on his forearm. The room became perfectly still. Outside the office windows, the morning sun reflected across the Chesapeake Bay, and a tugboat eased slowly toward open water, its low horn echoing across the base. Holloway looked beyond the glass without really seeing the harbor anymore. "Did the sailor describe how the man behaved?" he asked. "Yes, sir. He said the veteran never argued, never defended himself, and remained completely calm while another sailor mocked the tattoo." The Admiral nodded almost to himself. "That sounds like Tom." The executive officer looked up in surprise. "You know him, sir?" Holloway remained silent for several seconds before answering. "I know exactly one man who still turns the handle of his coffee mug before every first sip. He started doing it because the hottest part of the cup always faced the same direction after sitting near a camp stove. 40 years later, the habit never left him." The executive officer blinked. Daniel Mercer had mentioned that small detail almost casually during the phone call. Holloway rose from his chair and walked toward a wooden display case built into the office wall. Inside rested medals, retirement gifts, photographs with presidents, and ceremonial plaques collected over decades of service. He barely glanced at any of them. Instead, his eyes settled on a small framed picture tucked quietly in the back corner. 5 young men stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a weathered canvas shelter, smiling the uncertain smiles of men who had not yet grown old enough to understand how quickly life could disappear into memory. Holloway reached out and lightly touched the edge of the frame before letting his hand fall away. "Cancel the remainder of my schedule," he said. The executive officer hesitated. "Sir, the regional command conference begins in 30 minutes. Holloway calmly picked up his service cap. "The conference will still be there this afternoon. Thomas Callahan may decide to leave that diner in the next 10 minutes. There was nothing dramatic in the way he spoke. No urgency, no raised voice. Only the quiet certainty of a man who understood that some opportunities to honor the past arrived without warning and almost never came twice. A black government sedan was already waiting outside headquarters. As Holloway stepped into the morning sunlight, without another word, the driver pulled away from the curb and headed toward the harbor. While back at the diner, Thomas Callahan continued watching the tide, completely unaware that someone from another lifetime was already on the way. The black sedan turned off the main road and followed the narrow drive that overlooked the marina, before coming to a smooth stop outside the Harbor View Diner. Admiral Richard Holloway stepped onto the sidewalk alone, straightened his service jacket almost out of habit, and paused for a single moment before opening the door. The small brass bell above the entrance rang softly. It was an ordinary sound, yet every conversation inside seemed to lose its place. Mary looked up from the counter first. Daniel Mercer, standing near the entrance after returning inside, immediately recognized the Admiral and instinctively came to attention. Holloway acknowledged him with a slight nod, but did not stop. His attention had already settled on the corner booth beside the window. Thomas Callahan was still there, exactly as Daniel had described. The coffee mug sat with its handle pointing in the same direction. One hand rested lightly against the warm ceramic while the other remained folded on the table. Thomas glanced toward the doorway, and for the first time that morning the corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. "Richard," he said quietly. Holloway answered with a smile of his own, one that erased years of rank and ceremony in an instant. Tom. Neither man moved for several seconds. They simply looked at one another with the familiar recognition of people who no longer needed introductions. Brooks watched the exchange with growing confusion. He had expected the Admiral to greet the room, address the sailors, or ask what had happened. Instead, it seemed as though the rest of the diner had disappeared. Holloway finally walked to the booth and stopped beside the table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Thomas looked toward the empty seat across from him. "It has been waiting a long time." The Admiral laughed softly before sitting down. Mary quietly appeared with a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. Holloway thanked her by name, then turned back to Thomas. "Still 2 sugars?" he asked. Thomas nodded once. Some habits survive longer than uniforms. Holloway stirred the coffee exactly once before placing the spoon neatly on the saucer. Brooks noticed the movement immediately. It matched Thomas's routine almost perfectly. The similarity unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Gathering his courage, he stepped toward the table and cleared his throat. "Sir," he began carefully, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about this gentleman." Holloway slowly looked up. There was no anger in his face, only quiet disappointment. "No, Chief Brooks," he replied. "The misunderstanding began long before I arrived." The room fell silent again. Outside, the tide continued its steady rise against the dock pilings, while sunlight shimmered across the harbor. Inside, Holloway rested his eyes on the edge of Thomas's rolled sleeve, where the faded tattoo was barely visible beneath the fabric. He drew a slow breath, as though confirming something he had hoped to find for many years. "Tom," he asked gently, "would you allow me to see it again?" Thomas held the Admiral's gaze for a long moment before calmly rolling back his sleeve, revealing the weathered symbol once more. Holloway looked at it with quiet respect, then slowly reached toward the cuff of his own immaculate white uniform, his fingers pausing there just long enough for every person in the diner to realize that the next few seconds were about to change everything. Admiral Richard Holloway did not rush the moment. His fingers rested on the cuff of his sleeve for a heartbeat before he slowly folded the white fabric upward. Inch by inch, weathered skin appeared until a faded circle emerged beneath the morning light. Time had softened the ink on his arm just as it had on Thomas Callahan's, but the design was unmistakably the same. Nobody in the diner moved. A fork slipped gently from someone's hand onto a plate, with a quiet clink that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Brooks stared from one forearm to the other, searching for some explanation that refused to come. Holloway lowered his arm beside Thomas's so the 2 faded symbols rested only inches apart. "I have not seen that mark beside mine in more than 40 years, he said softly. "I prayed I would again." Thomas looked down at the matching tattoos and smiled with the quiet warmth of a man, greeting an old photograph rather than an old friend. "You always were the optimistic one," he replied. A gentle laugh escaped the Admiral. "And you always reminded the rest of us to keep our feet on the ground." The exchange carried no grand performance, only the easy rhythm of 2 men continuing a conversation that had been interrupted by decades instead of ending. Brooks swallowed hard. "Sir," he asked carefully, "what does it stand for?" Holloway looked toward the young sailors gathered around the room before answering. "It stands for 5 men who promised one another that they would never measure their lives by applause." He glanced toward Thomas. "The world never learned their names together, and that was exactly how they wanted it." Thomas folded his sleeve halfway down again. "Most of the important things we ever did disappeared with the sunrise the next morning," he said quietly. "That never bothered us." Daniel Mercer listened without taking his eyes off the 2 veterans. He realized that neither man had described a battle, a mission, or a victory. They spoke instead about promises, friendship, and responsibility. Somehow those things carried even greater weight. Holloway rested one hand gently on the table. "Tom taught every one of us that the strongest man in the room is usually the one who feels no need to prove it." Thomas gave a slight shake of his head. "Life teaches that lesson if you stay around long enough." Brooks lowered his eyes. The faded tattoo he had dismissed only an hour earlier no longer looked ordinary. It looked like the last surviving page of a story that history had quietly folded away. Outside, a pair of gulls glided above the harbor without beating their wings, carried effortlessly by the morning breeze. Thomas watched them through the window and smiled almost to himself. "Funny," he murmured. They still know how to trust the wind. Holloway followed his gaze toward the water. Some things never forget where they belong. No one spoke after that. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned, and every person inside the diner understood that they had just witnessed something far too meaningful to interrupt with another question. Thomas Callahan finished the last sip of his coffee and quietly placed the empty mug back onto the saucer with the same careful movement he had made every Tuesday morning for years. He reached into his jacket pocket, folded a few bills beneath the cup, and slowly stood. Age had bent his shoulders a little, but nothing had ever managed to bend the quiet dignity he carried. Admiral Richard Holloway rose with him, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect did. Without a word, every sailor in the diner followed. Chairs slid back across the floor one after another until the entire room stood in complete silence. No one had given an order. No one needed to. Brooks felt his face grow warm as he stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been that morning, "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I cannot change that, but I am truly sorry." Thomas looked at the young sailor for a long moment before offering a gentle smile that carried neither triumph nor resentment. "You are not the first young man to mistake age for weakness," he said. "The important part is deciding whether you learn from it." Brooks nodded slowly. "I will." Thomas reached out and gave the younger sailor's shoulder a light pat, the kind an old mentor might give without thinking. "Then this morning was worth both of our time." Holloway watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "You have always been better at teaching lessons than giving speeches, Tom." Thomas chuckled softly. "Speeches are easy. Living long enough to understand them is the hard part." A few people smiled through eyes that had grown unexpectedly damp. Daniel Mercer stepped aside as Thomas walked toward the front door. Just before leaving, the old veteran paused beside him. "Keep paying attention to the small things," he said. "Most people wait for history to announce itself. It almost never does." Daniel straightened instinctively. "I will remember that, sir." Thomas nodded once and pushed open the door. The cool Chesapeake breeze drifted inside, carrying the scent of salt water and pine, while the small brass bell above the entrance rang one final time. Everyone watched through the window as he walked toward the harbor, with his hands tucked comfortably into the pockets of his faded jacket. Halfway down the sidewalk, he stopped for a moment, looked across the water where the morning tide continued its quiet rhythm, then disappeared beyond the line of docked boats without ever looking back. Only after he was gone did Admiral Holloway slowly lower the sleeve of his uniform, covering the faded tattoo once again. "Some honors were never meant for display," he said softly. "They were meant to remind the people who carried them how to live." No one answered. They simply stood in thoughtful silence while the harbor continued exactly as it had before sunrise. The coffee would be poured again tomorrow. Sailors would return to work. Boats would leave the marina with the morning tide. Yet everyone inside that little diner carried home something invisible that could never be pinned to a uniform or framed on a wall. They had learned that the strongest reputations are often the quietest, that the deepest courage rarely introduces itself, and that respect is never demanded by those who have truly earned it. Some stories are remembered because they are told. The finest ones are remembered because the people who lived them never believed they needed to be.